Joe Biden had his soft vaccine mandate, and we'll talk about all this in detail. Some people take issue with the term soft mandate, but that's because they don't know what the fuck they're talking about and they're silly. But Joe Biden's soft mandate was slapped down by the Fifth Circuit Court. So let me go ahead and do I have here we go. I have an article for you, or a headline. Breaking: Fifth Circuit halts Biden vaccine mandate on businesses over grave constitutional concerns. Okay, so what is Joe Biden's policy? Well, we've talked about this previously, but the idea is simple. If you have a business with 100 employees or more, they need to either get vaccinated or take tests weekly, according to Biden. The businesses themselves might do it more, like every other day or maybe every day, depending on the business. But you either have to get vaccinated or test by early January. So now, let's not wage a war on nuance like some clowns out there. This is why I call it a soft mandate. A hard mandate would be you have to get the vaccine, no excuses, get the vaccine. That's a hard mandate. You want to know why? Because they're making you get the vaccine. If they say you can vaccinate or test, that would be an option. That would be a choice where you can easily opt out of getting the vaccine and just test. By the way, the tests take like 20 seconds. And with a lot of the rapid ones, you get the answer in 10 minutes or 15 minutes. So don't act like, this is an infringement on my liberty. Is it really? So just like wearing a seatbelt is an infringement on your liberty. Just like if you're working a construction job, you have to wear a helmet. Just like that's an infringement on your liberty. Just like when you go to school, they make you get the polio vaccine and the rubella vaccine and measles and mumps and all those. Is that what it is? It's an infringement on your liberty? We have to be careful to not be hyperbolic because there is such a thing as a reasonable rule and regulation versus something that crosses a line into what's tyrannical. Now, obviously, there's subjective interpretation that's involved in that, but I think people are a little silly when they act like Biden's policy is equivalent to just a hard mandate. It's a pure mandate. No, and you know that, and you're being misleading. People who call that a mandate, stop it. It's not just a mandate. If there's an easy way out of it that's approved, that would be, at best, a soft mandate. And I even think maybe I'm being a little too hard on the administration by calling it a soft mandate. So anyway, that's the policy. Now, the reason the policy is overly complex like that and really nuanced is because they wanted to make sure it fell within the confines of what OSHA could do. So the Fifth Circuit Court they're not totally slapping it down. They're staying it right now. So in other words, until a higher court makes a decision, they're saying don't implement it yet. Okay, well, it's probably going to go to the Supreme Court. Now, what's the Supreme Court going to do? Even though the Supreme Court is a very conservative court, guess what? This is an area where they're probably going to side with Biden. Why? Because every case recently that has to do with the vaccine mandate has gone in the direction of it's allowed. It's allowed. So, for example, there's some people who are in these vital industries like healthcare industry where they had a mandate and they didn't want to get the vaccine and they went to court and they were told, look, you work in a nursing home or you work in a hospital? If they have a mandate, you need to have it to be in the hospital. Yeah, get the vaccine. And the court decides that is a reasonable rule. That's a reasonable rule. And that's just recently. What a lot of people don't know is the case law of this stuff. So there was a case in 1905. That's how long ago. Jacobson versus Massachusetts. And it was a case that upheld the authority of states to enforce compulsory vaccination laws. They said, here, I want to give you some of this. Massachusetts was one of 11 states that had compulsory vaccination laws. And the Massachusetts law empowered the Board of Health of individual cities and towns to enforce mandatory free vaccinations for adults over the age of 21 if the municipality determined it was necessary for the public health or safety of the community. Adults who refused were subject to a $5 fine. And in 1902, there was an outbreak of smallpox. And in Cambridge, Massachusetts, they said, listen, you have to get the vaccine. Everybody's got to get the vaccine. Now, this is a really interesting case because there's a person by the name of Henning Jacobson who had lived through an era of mandatory vaccinations back in Sweden, and he actually had a very adverse effect. He had very adverse effects from a vaccine. And so he said, listen, I don't know what it is, but it's me. It's also my son. We have an we had a bad reaction. And so for whatever reason, we can't get vaccinated. And so I think this is an infringement on my liberty because I previously had a terrible reaction to the vaccine. So I know that I'm going to react that way. I should be exempt from this shit. And the Supreme Court said, no, bitch, you shouldn't be. And they upheld mandatory vaccinations done by states and cities. Okay, usually the corporations get even more leeway than a state does or a city does under our law. You could say, unfortunately, because that's a hyper-capitalist notion, right? But, see, this is really interesting to me, because what's my instinct reading this? Look, if there's evidence that dude reacts badly, of course he should be able to opt out of it, and that's why I'm in favor of a soft mandate, vaccine or test. Vaccine or test. So that's my position. But no, the Supreme Court took a harder line in 1905, and they said, this isn't unreasonable. There's a fucking pandemic out there. So you got to get vaccinated. So that was 1905. Now, case law since then has repeatedly and routinely upheld mandatory vaccinations. Again, for your kid to go to school, they have a bunch of mandatory vaccines that they have to take. So in this instance, with corporations generally getting more leeway than states and cities, and the rule is crafted so as it's not even a sweeping mandate, it's just vaccinate or test, and it's for businesses with over 100 employees, the Supreme Court is almost certainly going to fall on the side of the Biden administration is allowed to do this. So the Fifth Circuit Court here is being hyper-conservative, and it is ideological, and it is partisan, and don't let anybody tell you otherwise. All this is partisan. All this is politics, okay? And there is no such thing as like above the fray and non-political court. We're talking about interpreting laws here. That is inherently political, no matter what side you fall on. So anybody who acts like above the fray and just, very dry factual interpretations, there's no such thing. Everybody has their own interpretation of what it says, and the laws in many instances are vague and ambiguous. And when you're talking about something like the Constitution, the real law of the land, the supreme law of the land, a lot of this stuff hinges on what you define as what do you define as liberty? What do you define as free speech? What do you define as a right to this or that? What do you define as general welfare? So none of this is above politics. Nobody's above politics. And the Fifth Circuit Court here is the most conservative court, and they're making a very conservative decision, but even they're just staying it. They're not totally slapping it down. And my guess is the Supreme Court is going to reverse it, and I think it's going to be upheld. Listen, I think it's the most reasonable policy because the Biden policy, because you have to balance. There's two competing things that lefties care about, two competing values that lefties care about when you talk about vaccinations. One of them is individual rights. So, you have a right to do with your body whatever you want to do with your body as long as you're not hurting anybody else. That's your decision. That's your freedom. So that's one value that we care deeply about. The other value that we care deeply about is the community and the collective good of everybody in society. So how do you balance individual rights and liberty and freedom with the collective well-being? If the individual is making decisions that would greatly negatively affect the collective, the community, how do you walk that line? How do you find a balance where, both of those instincts are accommodated for? And thankfully, I think we found one. And that is get vaccinated or test. That's it. Get vaccinated or test. I think it's super reasonable, super straightforward, and I think ultimately the law will uphold that position, even though right now it was stayed because of a very conservative court.